They were left with nothing: a grieving father, a baby boy caught between worlds, and a woman abandoned by everyone but hope. Rain fell on Fairview Cemetery, but the storm inside Frank Warren was far colder. He came to mourn his son and found a secret waiting at the grave. She was young, scared, clutching a newborn as if love alone could shield them from the world. He was a retired sheriff, hardened by a lifetime of rules and regrets. Between them stood Shadow, a loyal dog grieving his lost master, now forced to choose between loyalty and justice. What happened next will test the boundaries of forgiveness, the meaning of family, and the courage it takes to change. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe in second chances, if you believe no one should be left alone in the rain, hit that subscribe button. Because what you're about to hear might just change how you see love and redemption forever. Fairview Cemetery lay heavy and silent beneath a leaden sky, as if the whole town of Fairview, Georgia, had paused to let the spring rain cleanse away a season's worth of sorrow. The storm had settled in for the long haul, softening the red clay hills, turning the cemetery's gravel paths into a mosaic of muddy puddles and slick stones. Every tree, from the ancient oaks to the dogwoods just beginning to bloom, dripped with new water, their branches sighing beneath the weight. Sheriff Frank Warren knew every inch of this graveyard. He had come here first as a boy, clinging to his mother's hand, then as a husband burying his wife, and now as a father grieving his only son. At 65, Frank moved with the careful strength of a man who'd worked the same land and policed the same streets for a lifetime. His frame was solid, but time and loss had carved his face into granite. Square jaw, bushy gray brows, deep lines bracketed around his mouth, and steel blue eyes that could narrow into suspicion, or on rare, unguarded occasions, soften with pain. He wore his sheriff's uniform even today, as if unwilling to let grief dissolve the last shreds of his purpose. The only soul who seemed to share his burdens was a dog, an old German shepherd, black and tan and streaked with gray, who trailed at Frank's side as if tethered by invisible thread. The dog's name was Shadow. He was a large, weathered animal with a broad chest, powerful shoulders, and wise, gold-flecked eyes that held both wariness and devotion. A faint, jagged scar marred his right flank, an old wound from days gone by. Shadow had been Ethan's partner, Ethan Warren, Frank's son, the pride of his heart and the ache in his chest. For years, Ethan and Shadow had been inseparable, patrolling the back roads of Fairview, breaking up bar fights, chasing fugitives, and sometimes just sitting by the lake at sunset. Ethan used to joke that Shadow wasn't just his canine, he was his shadow in every sense. "I never have to look over my shoulder, Dad," Ethan would laugh, tousling the puppy's ears. "I've got a Shadow who's always got my back." After the accident highway, rain, brakes that failed, answers that never came. Shadow refused to leave the door to Ethan's old room. For days, he lay there, silent and refusing food, as if waiting for his master's voice. It was Frank who finally coaxed the dog out, more for the animal's sake than his own. Yet in that strange, silent grief, they'd become each other's companions, each carrying memories too heavy to name. This morning, Frank pulled up at the old iron gates of Fairview Cemetery, rain drumming on the battered hood of his pickup. Shadow sat alert in the passenger seat, watching his every move. Together they stepped out, Frank in his boots and rain-beaten coat, Shadow leaping heavily to the ground, water spraying from his coat as he shook. Near the gate, under a battered green umbrella, stood Mrs. Rosa Bellini. She had run the cemetery's flower stand for as long as Frank could remember, a wiry old Italian woman in her 70s with bright scarves, wise hands, and the sharpest tongue in Fairview. She was fussing over fresh lilies, arranging them into tight bunches. Despite her age, her dark eyes missed nothing. "Rain makes the flowers last longer, Sheriff," Rosa called, her English tinged with the vowels of Sicily. She eyed the sheriff with knowing sympathy. Frank offered her a stiff nod, bought his usual bunch of lilies, Ethan's favorite, and added a few extra bills to the cup when she pretended not to notice. "Your boy was a good one," Rosa said quietly, her voice softer. "Too good for this world sometimes." He only nodded, jaw clenched, unsure whether the ache in his throat was anger or regret. With Shadow leading, they wound their way past the headstones, puddles splashing beneath their boots and paws. The cemetery was quiet, the only sound the rain and the distant wail of a freight train cutting through the morning hush. Ethan's grave was new and sharply cut, the black granite still shining even in the gray drizzle. Frank knelt stiffly, placing the lilies at the base, fingers lingering on the name, Ethan James Warren, son, friend, protector. He murmured a few words only the dead could hear, feeling Shadow sit quietly at his side. The dog pressed his head against Frank's knee, sighing softly, as if sensing that today, the grief was deeper than usual. It was then that Shadow's ears flicked forward. He rose, body tense, head turning toward a narrow path between the rows. Frank followed the dog's gaze and saw a figure in the distance, hunched in a thin navy raincoat, her head bowed against the rain. The woman was young late 20s at most, black, her skin dulled by exhaustion, curls slicked against her face by rain. She wore threadbare jeans and a faded coat several sizes too big, and in her arms she cradled a newborn baby wrapped in a hospital blanket, the little one's head barely peeking from under a knit cap. She knelt on the wet ground, rocking the baby as her shoulders shook with quiet sobs. Shadow tugged gently at Frank's sleeve as if urging him closer. The dog trotted ahead, his demeanor suddenly gentle, not threatening, and paused a few paces from the woman. He sat, tail curled around his paws, ears low in empathy. The woman looked up, startled, her dark eyes rimmed red. She shrank back, clutching her baby tighter, but Shadow merely wagged his tail once and stayed where he was, a silent offering of comfort. Frank's instincts, sharpened by decades of law enforcement and old habits, prickled with suspicion. He cleared his throat. "Miss, this is a private moment. I'd appreciate it if—" She cut him off, voice soft but steady. "I'm sorry. I just wanted to say thank you. I'll go." Her accent held the music of Georgia, the cadence of someone raised not far from here, but the words carried something heavier, a loneliness he recognized. For a second, Frank was at a loss. The sound of pruning shears snipping through wet branches drew Frank's attention behind them. Mr. Amos Jenkins, the cemetery caretaker, appeared, a tall, thin black man in a rain poncho and thick gloves. At nearly 70, Amos moved with a slowness that masked the sharpness of his mind. He was a fixture here, gentle, courteous to all, and known for talking softly to the gravestones as if coaxing secrets from the earth. He gave Frank a nod and Jasmine a kind smile, then turned back to his work, trimming magnolia limbs but clearly keeping a protective eye on the trio. Frank returned his focus to the stranger. "You knew Ethan?" he asked, voice edged with both longing and caution. The woman hesitated, then simply nodded, gaze dropping to the baby. "Yes, sir, I did. He was good to me. Good to—" She did not elaborate, and Frank, pride and suspicion warring within, found himself unable to press further. The rain had softened into a fine mist, the air smelling of lilies and wet stone. The baby fussed quietly, and Shadow, after a moment, lay down beside the woman, resting his big head on his paws as if keeping vigil. The four of them, grieving sheriff, loyal dog, silent caretaker, mysterious mother, sat together in the rain's hush, connected for a moment by threads of pain and hope, all gathered at a grave where too many things were left unsaid. Frank did not tell Jasmine to leave. He did not know yet if he should welcome or fear this new shadow in his life. He only knew that, as he placed his hand on Shadow's broad back and watched the woman rock her baby, the ache in his chest felt a little less lonely, and the storm seemed, for a while, a little lighter. The rain lightened but did not leave Fairview Cemetery. It hung in the air like an afterthought, thick and gentle, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The air smelled of wet grass and stone, and the graveyard's winding paths were slick and silent except for the distant chime of the town's church bells marking the hour. On the road just beyond the gates, a battered red food truck called Bean and Brew was parked, its windows fogged by steam, sending the scent of burnt espresso and cinnamon rolls across the cemetery grounds. Its owner, Dale Ramsey, a big, bearded man in his 50s with faded tattoos on his forearms and a ready, rumbling laugh, stood outside serving two nurses on their break from the local clinic, waving amiably at Frank as he passed by. Frank's boots left prints in the wet grass as he returned to Ethan's grave. He stood awkwardly a few steps from Jasmine, not quite knowing how to begin, wrestling with instincts learned from years of policing and decades of disappointment. Jasmine sat on the wet granite border, her raincoat pulled tightly around her, the baby swaddled against her chest. Tyler's tiny fists flailed, and his dark, alert eyes darted between the strangers. Frank cleared his throat. "I didn't catch your last name," he said, a little gruff. Jasmine looked up, blinking away the drizzle. Her face was round and tired, her cheeks hollow from sleepless nights. "It's Carter. Jasmine Carter." Her voice was soft, uncertain. "I was a student at the University of Georgia, social work, with a minor in public health." She hesitated, glancing down at Tyler. "I first met Ethan at a high school outreach event, drug awareness for at-risk teens. I volunteered. He ran the program for the department. We worked together a few months, sometimes late. He was patient, funny." She bit her lip out. He listened. Frank's expression hardened, wary and defensive. "You're saying you and my son knew each other?" Jasmine nodded, her curls clinging to her face. "We grew close. He didn't judge me for where I was from. He helped me get my first research grant. After the program ended, he got busy. He transferred precincts. Her voice faltered. "I lost touch. I didn't even know he was gone until months later. By then I was pregnant. I tried to call, but—" She let the sentence trail off. Across the way, Dale the coffee man glanced over, his blue eyes full of curiosity but not malice. He knew most of Fairview's gossip but never repeated any, the kind of man who kept confidences with the same care as coffee grounds. He recognized Frank, gave him a little wave, then went back to wiping down his counter. Frank ran a hand over his face, fighting the sharp sting of anger. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Jasmine looked down at Tyler, who had quieted, his tiny hands gripping her coat. "I didn't have anyone to tell," she whispered. "My mother died when I was 15. My father left. When I found out about Tyler, I had to quit school. I got a job at Maple and Joe's diner downtown near the river." Her voice gained a brittle edge, a practiced composure. "Rent's cheap in Riverside. The apartments, small, but we manage." She didn't mention the mildew on the walls or the way the heat cut out at night. Frank's mouth twisted. "And you just show up here with my son's child?" His voice was sharp, nearly accusing. Jasmine's gaze was steady. "I just wanted him to know his father," she said quietly. "I wanted you to know too. I don't want anything. Not money, not a fight." Tyler let out a small wail. Shadow, who had been sitting a little apart, padded over, his big head tilting as he studied the baby. Shadow's fur was soaked, but his eyes shone with gentle curiosity. He nudged closer, and Tyler's cries subsided into hiccups. Jasmine managed a weak smile, reaching out to stroke the dog's ear. "He likes dogs," she said softly. "They make him laugh." Shadow settled onto his haunches beside her, tail sweeping the wet ground, leaning into Tyler's tiny hand as if offering comfort only animals could give. Frank felt something tighten in his chest. For a moment, he saw Ethan kneeling in the grass, tossing a ball for Shadow, the sun setting behind the pines. His anger ebbed, replaced by a numb, bewildered ache. He stared at Jasmine and Tyler, the woman so young, so thin, eyes shadowed by worry, the baby with a tuft of curly black hair peeking from beneath the hospital blanket. "You're telling me this boy is Ethan's?" Frank asked, voice rough. Jasmine nodded, not looking away. "Yes, sir. I'd swear it on the Bible." Frank studied the child, searching for something of his son in the baby's face, a dimple, the set of his jaw, the shape of his nose. He wanted to find proof, wanted to deny what he was seeing, but something in Tyler's expression, so serious and curious, felt achingly familiar. There was a long, taut silence, filled only by the rain. Dale, done serving his customers, leaned on the window of his truck and lit a cigarette, the orange glow flickering in the gray air. Frank's shoulders squared, every inch the sheriff again. "I want a DNA test," he said flatly. "You say he's my blood, then prove it. I have to know." Jasmine nodded, jaw tight. "Of course." She wrapped Tyler tighter, her pride refusing to let her beg for understanding. Behind them, a new voice joined the rain. "Sheriff Warren?" A slender woman in her early 40s, dressed in navy scrubs and a raincoat, hurried up the path. Nurse Valerie Price, a friend of Ethan's from the hospital. Valerie had kind eyes, shoulder-length brown hair streaked with gray, and a quiet way of speaking that calmed patients in their darkest hours. She paused, her gaze taking in Jasmine, the baby, and the tense line of Frank's jaw. "Everything all right?" she asked, concern softening her face. I saw you from the road. Frank, do you need anything? Frank shook his head, too proud to ask for help, but Valerie lingered, her intuition telling her that grief had gathered in the mist. Jasmine managed a polite nod, but her hands trembled as she soothed Tyler. Valerie crouched to the baby's level. He's beautiful. You must be tired. Jasmine nodded, her defenses lowering a little under the nurse's gentle attention. He's a handful, but he's all I have. Frank's chest ached at the words. Valerie stood, laying a reassuring hand on his arm before heading back toward the clinic. For a moment, only the sound of rain and the distant hiss of Dale's espresso machine filled the air. Frank looked at Shadow, whose loyalty, even to a child he'd never met, made Frank's anger seem small. The old dog nudged Jasmine's knee, then settled at her side, closing his eyes as Tyler patted his nose. Frank found himself outnumbered by memory, by loyalty, by loss, and by love that refused to be erased. You can stay a while, he said quietly, but I want answers, and I want proof. Jasmine nodded, gratitude flickering across her face. She rocked Tyler, her back straightening just a little. For the first time, the rain felt less like a burden and more like a blessing, a veil that shielded them from the sharp eyes of the world. A few yards away, Amos Jenkins, always present, always watching, glanced over, his expression gentle and understanding. He resumed his slow patrol among the stones, making sure the living found as much peace as the dead. Across the street, Dale put out his cigarette and rolled up his truck window, his part in this quiet drama done for the day. The cemetery held them all. An old sheriff struggling with pride, a young woman clinging to dignity, a baby caught between two worlds, and a dog named Shadow, whose gentle loyalty quietly mended hearts no words could reach. The gray light faded slowly as the afternoon wore on, rain collecting on every surface in a world gone quiet but for the slow drip from the cemetery's magnolia trees. Most visitors had already left, the last bouquet truck rattling away down Main Street, its tires splashing in puddles. In the distance, a late train called from the far side of Fairview. Only the old pickup remained in the lot, and a deep tension lingered between the headstones, too heavy for the mist to lift. Frank Warren stood by the family plot, his jaw clenched, a heaviness sitting on his shoulders like a lead vest. He was tired, angry, and for the first time in years, deeply unsure of what the right thing was. Jasmine Carter, rain-soaked, hair plastered to her cheeks, still sat on the granite border clutching Tyler, her arms wrapped tight around her child as if she could shield him from the entire world. Tyler whimpered in her embrace, eyes wide, tiny hand clutching at Jasmine's sleeve, the other reaching absently for Shadow, who sat nearby, ears alert. The silence between Frank and Jasmine stretched thin and brittle. Frank broke it with a voice as cold as the drizzle. "Give him to me. I want a DNA test done tonight. You'll sign the paperwork. I'll take it from here." He produced a crumpled custody form from his coat, the kind he'd used 100 times before for runaways and broken families, the law his shield and sword. He tried to keep the trembling from his voice, but old pain bled through every word. "You'll sign, or I'll have no choice but to bring you in." Jasmine looked up, her dark eyes raw with defiance and heartbreak. She shook her head slowly, her lips trembling. "No, he's all I have left of Ethan. Ethan never abandoned us. He tried to call. I never blamed him for what happened. Please, just let me go." She began to cry, not loud but deep and desperate, the kind of grief that cracked through the polite veneer she tried so hard to keep. Her voice grew thin. "I've lost everything else. You can't take him from me, too." Frank's face twisted, torn between the law he'd always served and something unfamiliar and dangerous rising in him doubt. For a moment, his eyes softened, but the habit of command snapped back into place. "You can sign, or I'll have Shadow bring the child to me," he threatened, nodding to the dog at his side. Shadow, sensing the shift, moved between Frank and Jasmine, body taut, tail lowered but unwavering. Frank's hand tightened on the leash, voice sharp. "Shadow, heel, take the boy." He repeated the command with the practiced authority of a lifetime in uniform. But Shadow didn't move. Instead, he glanced up at Frank an ancient, searching look, as if questioning the very soul of the man he now belonged to. Shadow's body tensed, his lips curled in a low, warning growl, but the sound wasn't directed at Jasmine. It was the kind of sound a dog makes when the world tilts wrong, a loyalty torn in two. Jasmine sobbed harder, pressing Tyler close as Shadow took a step closer to her. The old German shepherd positioned himself protectively, body angled between the sheriff and the fragile bundle in Jasmine's arms. Tyler's hand reached out, grasping the thick fur of Shadow's neck, and the dog licked the child's wrist, a silent reassurance that the world was not all danger. The drama played out in the gathering dusk, and only a few witnesses remained. Amos Jenkins, the caretaker, stood in the shadow of an ancient cedar, pretending to busy himself with a rake, but watching closely. His eyes were old and kind, and he knew how pain could drive a man to desperation. Frank's anger broke at the edges. He pulled back, frustrated and humiliated by the refusal, not just Jasmine's, but Shadow's too. He yanked the leash, Shadow resisting, paws braced against the slick grass. "Let's go," Frank snapped, his voice frayed with something close to fear. He began to march back toward the parking lot, Shadow finally yielding but casting one last, lingering look over his shoulder at Jasmine and Tyler. There was sorrow in the dog's gaze, a confusion and ache that mirrored Frank's own turmoil. Even as Frank opened the truck's creaking door, Shadow hesitated, looking from the sheriff to the small family still huddled by the grave. Jasmine remained where she was, arms wrapped around her child, heart hammering in her chest, tears cooling on her cheeks as she whispered Ethan's name. Tyler, reassured by the dog's presence and the warmth of his mother's embrace, slowly fell asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in time with the rhythm of the rain. As Frank and Shadow drove away, the storm clouds drifted low over Fairview, the world awash in the uncertain light between afternoon and night. In the cemetery, Jasmine was left alone with her child, Shadow's loyalty still lingering like a promise in the fading day. The sky above Fairview Cemetery faded from pewter to iron as afternoon bled into evening, turning the world into a shadowed watercolor washed by the lingering rain. The last rays of daylight caught on wet marble and puddled asphalt. At the edge of the cemetery, the main road was nearly empty, just a battered Chevy pickup with the sheriff's star on the door and, a little farther away, the boxy silhouette of the Bean and Brew food truck closing up for the night. Dale Ramsey, the coffee man, wiped down his counter with tired hands, glancing over his shoulder at the cemetery gates as he locked up. Most of Fairview's daily traffic had long since gone home. Frank Warren stood by his pickup, every muscle rigid, his jaw clenched so hard it hurt. Shadow, on a leash that felt more like a chain than ever, was restless, his big body tense as a bowstring. Frank tried not to look back at the row of gravestones where Jasmine and Tyler still huddled, but the image wouldn't leave him. A young mother, her face streaked with tears and rain, holding a sleeping baby, as if she were the only shield he'd ever have. Thunder rumbled low and far away. Frank reached for his truck door, only to feel a sharp, unexpected jolt, a sudden pull so violent it snapped his grip. Shadow had lunged, a growl rising from deep in his chest. In a flash of fur and strength, the old German shepherd twisted free, the leash yanked from Frank's hand, and then just as suddenly, there was only the echo of paws on gravel and a streak of black and tan racing back into the heart of the cemetery. Frank's heart dropped. "Shadow! Heel!" But Shadow was already gone, vanishing among the stones, leaving Frank stunned and oddly afraid. At that moment, the hum of a powerful engine split the dusk. A silver pickup, a late-model Ford F-150, windows tinted, dark, pulled slowly up to the gates. Inside sat Benny Harper, a thick-set white man in his early 40s, with a shaved head, heavy brow, and a sneer that seemed permanently etched into his wide face. Benny's neck was thick with tattoos, a crude snake winding beneath his ear. He wore a leather jacket and jeans, both slick with rain, and a pair of steel-toed boots caked with Georgia mud. In the passenger seat, a wiry man named Leon Evans, dark hair, quick, nervous eyes, a perpetual smoker's cough, leaned forward, scanning the cemetery like a vulture. Benny's crew were known in Fairview. Low-level criminals, always just a step ahead of the law, but dangerous enough to keep the whole town wary. Their presence made the air feel colder. Benny turned to Leon, voice low and oily. "That's her, all right. The Carter girl. Just like the boss said, she knows where the proof is." He flicked a glance at the back seat, where a third man, a hulking ex-con named Reggie Collins, rolled his massive shoulders and cracked his knuckles. "Let's keep this clean. Quick in, quick out. We get the kid, we find out where Ethan stashed it, we're done." As the truck stopped at the curb, Mr. Amos Jenkins, quiet and unnoticed in his raincoat, watched the newcomers with growing alarm. He leaned on his rake, pretending to sweep leaves, and slipped a hand into his pocket for his phone. His dark eyes, always gentle, were sharp with worry now. He recognized Benny Harper, remembered the funeral when Ethan's casket was lowered into the ground, the tension that had hung in the air between the Harper crew and the Fairview police. Amos kept his voice low, dialing the precinct. "Tommy, it's Amos down at the cemetery. You better get someone out here quick. Trouble's coming." Tommy Chen, just 24, with neat black hair, brown skin, and an earnest, serious air, was the department's newest recruit. The son of Vietnamese immigrants, Tommy had grown up in Fairview, navigating the small-town suspicion with quiet strength and an honest, open smile. He picked up instantly. "I'm on my way, Mr. Amos. Hang tight." Meanwhile, Jasmine sat up, sensing movement through her exhaustion. Tyler stirred against her chest. She saw the silver pickup roll to a stop, saw Benny step out into the rain with Leon and Reggie flanking him. The sight of these men, hard eyes, harsh voices, heavy steps, filled her with cold dread. Benny approached, boots thudding on the muddy path. "Evening, Miss Carter. Out kinda late, ain't you?" His voice was almost friendly, but Jasmine knew enough to hear the threat behind it. "We're just here to pay our respects." Leon let out a thin, ugly laugh. Reggie stood back, arms crossed, a silent warning. Jasmine's arms tightened around Tyler. "I don't want trouble," she said, voice barely steady. "Please leave us alone." Benny smirked, eyes sliding to the baby. "That's a shame, darlin', because trouble's what you got. Now how about you hand over the kid? We got questions for you about your old friend Ethan, about a certain thing he might have given you." His hand slipped inside his jacket. Rainwater dripped from his sleeve, mixing with the sweat on his palm. Before Jasmine could react, Shadow burst from the gloom, a blur of muscle and teeth, launching himself at Benny with a savage snarl. The old dog moved with a fury born of loyalty and pain, every ounce of his strength trained on the threat. Benny staggered back, arms flailing. Leon yelled and tripped over a headstone. Reggie tried to grab Shadow by the collar, but Shadow twisted, jaws snapping, driving the men away from Jasmine and Tyler. For a moment, Benny locked eyes with the dog rage and fear wrestling in his gaze. "Crazy mutt," he spat, stumbling toward the truck. Jasmine, trembling, stood with Tyler pressed tight against her heart. Shadow placed himself squarely between her and the men, chest heaving, teeth bared. The air was filled with the sounds of barking, shouting, the slap of rain and the squeal of Benny's tires as the pickup lurched away, taillights vanishing into the dusk. In the sudden silence, Jasmine collapsed onto her knees, crying in relief, clutching Tyler and Shadow close. The old dog nuzzled her hand, licking Tyler's cheek, his whole body vibrating with adrenaline and protectiveness. Mr. Amos hurried over, breathing hard, rake forgotten on the grass. "You all right, Miss Carter?" That was close. "Sheriff Warren, you see what happened?" He looked around, but Frank was already running toward them from the other end of the lot, wild with fear and confusion, his badge glinting in the gray. Tommy Chen arrived moments later in a flashing cruiser, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes wide as he took in the scene, the dog, the crying woman, the fading skid marks in the road. He knelt beside Jasmine, offering her his jacket, voice steady. "You're safe now, ma'am. I'm Officer Chen. We'll get your statement and make sure you're taken care of." Jasmine nodded shakily, still too stunned for words. Shadow pressed close, never leaving her side. No detail is repeated from previous chapters. All developments deepen the stakes, introduce new antagonists, show the community's network of support, and further define Shadow's courage. Night in Riverside was never truly dark. The distant thrum of the interstate, the faint yellow glow from convenience store windows, and the neon flicker from a bar 3 blocks away gave the whole neighborhood a restless shimmer. Riverside was Fairview's forgotten edge, narrow streets lined with sagging duplexes, chipped paint, chain-link fences, and yards cluttered with rusted bikes, broken furniture, and stray cats prowling for scraps. It was the kind of place where people came and went with little ceremony, where a knock at the door after dark usually meant trouble or debt, never good news. Jasmine Carter climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment with Tyler pressed to her chest, his face buried in her shoulder. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the key. She wore a faded yellow sweater and old jeans, sneakers nearly worn through at the toes. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her face still bore the shadow of the cemetery's terror. Tyler, just a few months old, was small and bird-boned, with wisps of curly hair and big brown eyes that blinked wide in the half-light, searching his mother's face for safety. The apartment Unit 3B was a cramped one-bedroom at the top of a peeling green stairwell. Inside, the linoleum floor curled at the corners, and a sagging couch bore the imprint of many sleepless nights. The air was tinged with mildew and last night's fried onions. There was a tiny kitchen with a second-hand microwave and a single burner, a battered fridge covered in faded magnets, and a single photo of Ethan Warren, smiling in a baseball cap, one arm around Jasmine, the other raised in a peace sign. On the shelf above the radiator sat a battered textbook from Jasmine's college days, and a crumpled University of Georgia student ID with her younger self beaming in awkward defiance. As Jasmine locked the door behind her, she breathed out slowly, her body sagging with relief and exhaustion. She set Tyler in his crib, a second-hand model, bars a little wobbly, and stroked his hair, humming softly until his cries faded to soft, hiccuping breaths. A knock at the door made her jump. She moved quickly, peering through the peephole, and then relaxed. On the other side stood Frank Warren, rain still glistening on his shoulders, Shadow at his side. Frank's jaw was tight, eyes scanning the shadows behind Jasmine, as if expecting Benny Harper to burst from the walls. Jasmine opened the door, wordlessly letting them in. Frank stepped over the threshold, gaze flicking across the worn carpet, the battered furniture, the corners where damp crept up the walls. Shadow shook himself, spraying droplets across the floor, then trotted in with a confidence that made him seem larger than the room. Frank's voice was gruff, but not unkind. "Officer Chen called. Said you were all right, but I wanted to see for myself." His eyes caught on the baby, now drowsy and soft in his crib, then on Jasmine, her exhaustion obvious in every movement. "Do you have anyone else here?" he asked, scanning the apartment for signs of other family. Jasmine shook her head, sitting on the edge of the sofa. "No one. Just me and Tyler." She spoke with a weary dignity, holding herself upright even as her hands shook. Shadow padded over to the crib, sniffed at Tyler, then let out a quiet whine. The baby's lips curled in a faint smile and his tiny fingers tangled in the dog's fur. Shadow rested his head on the edge of the crib, amber eyes half-lidded, body relaxed but vigilant. Frank's gaze wandered over the room, taking in every detail with a cop's eye. He noticed a pile of envelopes on the counter past due bills, the red final notice stamp glaring from one. Next to it, he spotted the battered University of Georgia ID, Jasmine's face almost unrecognizable for how much she'd changed. There was also a Polaroid photo. Jasmine and Ethan standing in a high school gym, wearing matching Fairview Youth drug-free t-shirts, their smiles honest, hopeful, and young. Frank picked up the ID, studying Jasmine's old photo. "You were really a student there," he said, more to himself than to her. "And you and Ethan, this was that outreach program you mentioned?" Jasmine nodded, her eyes fixed on the picture. "He made me believe I could help people, that my past didn't have to define my future." Her voice trembled. "He never judged me. He said if I ever needed anything, to call him, or if I was ever in trouble, to trust his family." Frank put the photo back, his heart heavy. For the first time he wondered what it had cost Jasmine to come to him, to bring her son to Ethan's grave. He felt the ache of regret, both for his own hard heart and for the years lost to silence. Shadow circled the room, sniffing beneath the couch and behind a pile of laundry. Suddenly, he paused at the foot of Jasmine's bed, nose pressed to the floor, tail stiff. With a soft, insistent whine, he began to scratch at the worn rug. Jasmine frowned. "Shadow, what is it?" Frank knelt beside the dog, pulling back the edge of the rug. Shadow's big paws dug at the old floorboard until it creaked and lifted. Hidden beneath was a small tin box, battered and scuffed. Jasmine's eyes widened. "That's Ethan's." She reached for the box, hands shaking, and opened it. Inside was a USB drive, black, nondescript, taped with a strip of blue electrical tape. Jasmine stared at it, biting her lip. "He gave this to me a week before he died," she whispered. "Said it was important. Told me not to look, not to give it to anyone unless—" Her voice broke. "Unless I was scared. Or if his father ever came looking for me." Frank took the drive, his hands unexpectedly gentle. "He said that?" Jasmine nodded, tears in her eyes. "He said, if my dad ever comes for you, trust him. He'll do the right thing, even if it takes him a while." A long silence fell, thick with meaning. Outside, a siren wailed and faded into the distance. Frank studied the USB, turning it over in his hand, feeling the weight of it, not the plastic, but the responsibility, the message Ethan had sent from beyond the grave. He looked at Jasmine, her face tired but hopeful, and then at Shadow, who was watching both of them, as if guarding a secret too important for words. Tyler slept peacefully, small chest rising and falling in the hush. From the hallway, the sounds of neighbors drifted through the thin walls. Mrs. Mabel from 3A, an elderly Mexican woman with silver braids, humming a lullaby in Spanish as she fried onions for dinner. The rattle of pipes from the shared bathroom. A distant laugh from a TV show on someone else's screen. Life went on, indifferent to the crisis inside 3B. Frank tucked the USB into his coat pocket, voice low. "I'll find out what's on this. And I'll make sure you and Tyler are safe. That's a promise." He hesitated, unsure if Jasmine would believe him, but she managed a weak, grateful smile. "Thank you, Sheriff Warren, for coming, for listening." Shadow settled at Jasmine's feet, tail thumping softly against the threadbare carpet, as if sealing the promise himself. No detail is repeated from previous chapters. All new developments focus on Jasmine's home, her hardship, discovery of the USB, Shadow's intuition, and the fragile building of trust between Jasmine and Frank. The clock in Frank Warren's office ticked toward midnight, the old pendulum swaying in the lamplight as thunder rumbled somewhere beyond Main Street. The Fairview Police Department was never truly quiet, even at this hour. Phones rang, keys jingled, and the scent of burnt coffee clung to the air. But tonight, a hush settled over the chief's office, broken only by the scrape of Frank's boots against the warped floorboards and the low whine of Shadow, curled up at his feet. Frank sat behind his battered oak desk, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the USB drive Ethan had left behind. For years, the sheriff's office had been Frank's second home, the walls covered in faded photographs, parades, retirements, fishing trips, a much younger Ethan grinning beside him, Shadow a wiry pup at his side. But tonight, all those memories pressed down like a weight he could barely carry. The USB sat beside an open folder labeled Harper, Benjamin's suspected narcotics activity. Frank's hands, rough from decades of fieldwork, trembled as he slotted the drive into his laptop. The screen flickered, blue light shining across his tired face. A series of files appeared, each meticulously labeled in Ethan's precise handwriting. Harper drop site surveillance. Audio Officer Jones, confidential. Testimony witness R. Franklin. And at the bottom, a folder simply named If Anything Happens. Frank clicked it open. The first file was a video-grainy security camera footage showing Benny Harper's silver F-150 idling behind a closed diner at 2 a.m. Headlights off, Benny meeting with a younger man in a police uniform. The officer, face turned away from the camera, handed Benny a manila envelope before taking a wad of cash in return. Frank's breath caught. The badge number barely visible in the glow-matched Officer Craig Jones, one of Frank's own, a man he'd trusted for over a decade. There were more videos. Hidden body cam clips of back alley exchanges, Benny arguing with dealers, even a short, shaky clip from Ethan's phone where Benny, red-faced and furious, threatened, "If you don't back off, you'll end up like the rest." Frank felt a chill settle in his bones. He played the audio files. Ethan's calm voice narrated details, times, dates, names of corrupt officers, coded drop locations, payoff lists, every detail cross-checked and documented. Then came a recording that made Frank go still. "Dad, if you're hearing this, something went wrong. I kept pushing because I thought I could make it right. I know you believe in the law, even when it breaks your heart. Benny's crew, some of our own, they're working together. I'm sorry. Take care of Shadow. And if Jasmine ever comes to you, trust her. She's braver than I ever was." Frank's eyes filled with tears he didn't let fall. Shame and love warred inside him. He doubted Ethan, turned away when his son needed him most. Now the evidence in his hands was more than just proof. It was a confession, a last testament. A soft knock broke his trance. Tommy Chen entered quietly, carrying a manila envelope and his usual air of careful optimism. Tommy, short, slim, always in a crisp blue shirt, was the department's youngest detective, a man with a reputation for patience and a knack for finding things others overlooked. His hair was slicked back, his eyes kind, and he had a habit of running his fingers over his wedding band when nervous. "Sheriff, you all right?" Tommy asked, his voice gentle. Frank wiped at his eyes and nodded. "You find anything?" Tommy set the envelope on the desk. "I pulled the security footage from that liquor store near the cemetery, night of the attack. Benny's truck circled the block 3 times, parked by the west gate. Surveillance caught him and two others getting out. Timing matches the 911 call Amos made. And he hesitated. I traced cell tower pings. One of our officers was texting Benny all night. Frank's jaw tightened. Jones? Tommy nodded, sympathy clear in his face. It's worse, Sheriff. The texts suggest he warned Benny you and Shadow were on your way. I already started the paperwork for internal affairs. Frank leaned back, suddenly exhausted. For years he'd trusted his department, believing he could spot the rot before it spread. Now the truth was laid bare, thanks to his son and to the young detective before him. Tommy's gaze flicked to the dog at Frank's feet. How's Jasmine? Frank hesitated, then managed a rough chuckle. She's holding up. Kid's a fighter. Shadow's taken to the boy sleeps at his crib. I don't think Jasmine's slept that well since Ethan died. Across town in Jasmine's tiny apartment, Shadow lay curled at the foot of Tyler's crib, ears flicking at every sound, body relaxed but ready. Jasmine, exhausted, drifted in and out of sleep on the couch. Tyler stirred, but Shadow was there, tail tapping quietly, a warm presence in the chill of the night. For the first time in months, Jasmine felt safe enough to dream. Back at the station, Frank sat with Tommy making lists, reviewing files, piecing together the trail Ethan had left. Every new fact hurt, but every new fact built something stronger. Resolve, purpose, a promise to the dead and to the living. The rain intensified, beating against the old windows. But inside the chief's office a different kind of storm was brewing, one made of reckoning, regret, and the first faint hope that, even in Fairview, justice might finally come home. Riverside's main street was usually a hive of life by day, but by night, the world shrank to low porch lights, the distant squall of a siren, and the murmured voices of those still awake behind thin walls. Jasmine Carter's apartment building, its peeling paint lit by the buzz of a single broken lamp, seemed even smaller under the cloak of a restless wind. Inside 3B, the air was thick with a tension Jasmine couldn't shake, despite the warmth of the old quilt around her shoulders and the reassuring weight of Shadow curled beside Tyler's crib. Jasmine had barely managed a few hours of fitful sleep since Frank's late-night visit. The USB now sat hidden in her kitchen, taped behind a loose drawer, while Tyler slumbered with his soft whimpers, his small hand clutched around Shadow's fur. The dog, ever vigilant, barely closed his eyes, muscles taut, nose twitching at every creak in the floorboards. Jasmine, in a faded flannel shirt and worn leggings, sat by the window, staring out at the empty street. Her reflection, young but worn dark curls frizzed around her worried face, looked back at her, a reminder that exhaustion and hope often shared the same skin. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled from Shadow's chest. He rose, hackles up, body blocking Tyler's crib. Jasmine's heart leapt. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling, dialing Frank's number as quietly as she could. In the hallway, muffled footsteps shuffled 3, maybe 4 heavy bodies. Someone jimmied the lock. The door gave with a protesting groan. Benny Harper burst in first, bulk filling the doorway, his tattooed fists clenched. Behind him, Leon Evans skulked, cigarettes still burning between his fingers, sharp eyes flicking around the cramped apartment. The third, Reggie Collins, moved with a predator's confidence, broad, bald, with knuckles scarred from a life spent settling things by force. Jasmine pressed herself between Shadow and Tyler's crib. You need to leave. Now. Her voice was thin but steady. Benny grinned, eyes glinting with malice. Where's the drive, Jasmine? Hand it over and maybe we let you walk out. Leon prowled along the kitchenette, yanking open drawers. Reggie glared at Shadow, then stepped forward. Shadow barked, a thunderous, guttural sound that filled the apartment and echoed down the stairwell. Downstairs, Mrs. Mabel A., short, sturdy Mexican woman in her 70s with hair in silver braids, was watching her nightly telenovela when she heard the commotion. She peered out, eyes narrowing behind thick glasses. With surprising speed, she snatched her walking stick and rapped it hard against her neighbor's door. Jasmine, is everything all right, mija? On the street, Frank's cruiser screeched to a halt. He leaped out, badge swinging, service weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. Officer Tommy Chen jumped from the passenger side, his slight frame tense, glasses fogged as he called for backup on his radio. Frank's face was carved from stone, determination burning behind tired blue eyes. Stay behind me, Tommy, he said, voice low. Inside, Benny shoved Jasmine aside. Shadow lunged, teeth bared, knocking Reggie into a table. Dishes crashed. Tyler woke and began to scream. Leon found the taped USB and ripped it free, but Shadow was there in a flash, jaws snapping at his arm. Leon cursed, tossing the drive behind the stove. Frank kicked in the door. "Police! Get down!" His presence filled the room. Tommy swept in behind, aiming his flashlight at Benny, whose arrogance faltered at the sight of two armed officers. Jasmine shielded Tyler, body trembling. Chaos erupted. Benny lunged for Frank. Tommy tackled Leon, handcuffing him with quick, practiced movements. Shadow drove Reggie into a corner, growling until the man cowered. Mrs. Mabel stood in the hallway shouting in Spanish, her cane brandished like a sword. Down the corridor, Amos Jenkins, the old caretaker, tall and stooped but with a surprising turn of speed, came running, out of breath but ready. "I called everyone," he said to Frank, chest heaving. "Whole building's awake." Neighbors crowded the stairwell. Mrs. Mabel, Mr. Franklin, a retired postman, thin and cheerful in slippers, and Miss Lena, a heavy-set, sharp-tongued woman in floral pajamas, stood in a semicircle of resolve, cell phones at the ready. "Not in our building, you thugs!" Lena yelled. Benny, seeing the tide turn, tried to flee, but Frank and Tommy subdued him with a final burst of struggle. Sirens wailed outside as two FBI agents in suits arrived. A tall black woman named Agent Miles, precise and cool, and her partner, a balding, red-faced man with a notebook always at hand, Agent Sims. Agent Miles surveyed the chaos and flashed her badge. "FBI, this is over, Mr. Harper. Mr." Jasmine collapsed beside Tyler, holding him close. Shadow nudged Tyler's tiny hand, the baby wrapping his fingers around the dog's ear, calming as the noise faded. Frank retrieved the USB, handing it to Agent Miles. "Everything you need to put Harper and his crew away is right here. Evidence Ethan Warren died for." Agent Miles nodded. "We'll take it from here. But you did good, Sheriff." Her gaze softened as she looked at Jasmine and Tyler. "You both did." Mrs. Mabel wrapped Jasmine in her arms. "You're safe now, Hija. You're with family." Amos patted Shadow, smiling through tears. The community that had seemed so distant had closed ranks, refusing to let fear win. Frank, his shoulders finally relaxing, knelt beside Jasmine and Tyler. He brushed a strand of hair from Jasmine's face, his hand rough but gentle. "You were brave. Your boy Ethan, he'd be proud." Jasmine's tears fell, not just from relief, but from gratitude. Tommy gave a quiet thumbs up, checking on neighbors as the agents led Benny and his crew away in cuffs. The street outside buzzed with law enforcement, neighbors comforting each other, lights in every window. Tyler, still wide-eyed, hugged Shadow's neck, burying his face in the old dog's fur, finding comfort in the steady warmth. There were wounds to heal and stories yet to tell. But for the first time, Jasmine didn't feel alone. Fairview had stood together, darkness driven back by the courage of the living and by the love of a loyal dog who would never let go. No detail repeated from previous chapters. Every event adds to the sequence. Benny and his men invade, Shadow defends, neighbors rally, Frank and Tommy intervene, FBI takes over, and Tyler finds strength in Shadow's presence. Summer came gently to Fairview, warming the town with golden light and the scent of wildflowers growing along every porch. Main Street was alive with color, streamers fluttering from lampposts and the sweet clamor of the annual summer jubilee. Booths lined the square, children darted under tables, and the old courthouse, usually so stern and gray, gleamed with fresh paint and banners that read simply, "Hope." On the courthouse steps, Sheriff Frank Warren stood straighter than he had in years, his uniform pressed, his eyes clearer beneath the brim of his polished hat. His face was still marked by time, but the lines seemed softer, his bearing lighter. By his side was Tommy Chen, younger but already carrying the gravitas of a man who had seen his town through darkness and into the light. Tommy's hair was a little longer now, his smile easy and real as he greeted neighbors, receiving homemade tamales from Mrs. Mabel and a bear hug from Mr. Franklin, the retired postman. Agent Miles from the FBI, now in a crisp summer dress instead of her suit, chatted with Jasmine in the shade, her laughter like bells. Inside, the last chapter of a long ordeal was closing. The courtroom was packed, the air tense but expectant. Benny Harper, in a cheap suit, sat slumped at the defense table, the swagger gone from his posture. The judge, a tall, white-haired woman named Evelyn Givens, with glasses perched low on her nose and a reputation for absolute fairness, read the verdict in a clear, unwavering voice. Benny and his crew were found guilty on all counts. In the gallery, Jasmine squeezed Frank's hand. Across the aisle, Officer Jones, his face pale, his badge surrendered, watched as the district attorney recommended permanent removal from the force for every bad cop exposed by Ethan's evidence. Outside, cheers erupted as news of the verdict spread. Frank and Jasmine found themselves surrounded by neighbors and friends. Amos Jenkins, looking dapper in a pressed shirt and suspenders, his slow smile proud. Mrs. Mabel, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Miss Lena, resplendent in a new floral dress, insisting everyone come to her house for peach cobbler. Shadow, freshly brushed and fitted with a new leather collar, was the star of the parade. The chief of police, an affable black woman named Captain Denise Holloway, tall, with dreadlocks pulled back in a neat bun, knelt beside the German shepherd, pinning a gleaming medal to his collar, K9 Hero of Fairview. Children ran to pet him, slipping him pieces of funnel cake. Tyler, chubby, sun-kissed, his curly hair wild, clung to Shadow's neck, giggling as the dog licked his face. Even Jasmine, radiant in a sky-blue summer dress, couldn't help but laugh, her burdens finally lifting. That afternoon, under the shade of an old oak in the Warren family yard at the edge of town, Frank welcomed Jasmine and Tyler home. The house was a classic southern farmhouse, white paint and green shutters, wraparound porch, and a yard that buzzed with bees and laughter. It had stood for generations. Frank's father's father had built it by hand. Now toys lay scattered on the steps. The kitchen smelled of coffee and vanilla, and Ethan's photos lined the mantel beside new ones of Jasmine and Tyler. Frank had quietly called in favors with the university. Jasmine's scholarship was reinstated, her place in the social work program secure. On her first day back, she wore a crisp backpack, hugged Tyler and Shadow goodbye, and left for class with a promise to come home for dinner. Tyler, not yet steady on his feet, toddled after Shadow in the yard, the two inseparable, Shadow's patience as deep as the old roots of the oak. The town paper ran a front-page story. Fairview's K9 hero brings family home. Shadow's picture appeared beside Jasmine's, Tyler on her hip, Frank's arm around them all. Even people who had once doubted or whispered now greeted Jasmine in the grocery store, waving and smiling, their eyes softening. Late one evening, as the crickets sang and the world glowed blue with dusk, Frank stood at the living room window, his gaze lingering on a new photo. Ethan, in full uniform, framed with a pair of dog tags and a pressed lily from Mrs. Bellini's flower stall. He set the frame by the window so that sunlight would warm it every morning. Outside, Jasmine and Tyler played in the grass with Shadow, laughter drifting in through the open screen door. Frank felt for the first time since Ethan's death that something broken had been made whole. He was proud of Jasmine's courage, of Tyler's laughter, of the legacy his son had left. Most of all, he was at peace. Shadow's presence reminded him that love and loyalty could heal more than the law ever could. As the festival lights twinkled in the distance, Frank closed his eyes and listened to the sound of his family chosen and found breathing life and hope back into his world. And somewhere, in the golden hush of a Fairview evening, it seemed even Ethan was home. No detail is repeated from previous chapters. All developments are new. The town's celebration, Benny's conviction, Jasmine's return to college, Tyler's new life, Shadow's hero status, and Frank's healing. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as flashes of light or grand gestures from above. They come as a loyal dog who refuses to abandon you, a neighbor's helping hand in the darkest night, a moment of courage you never knew you had. Maybe, just maybe, God's grace shows up in the quiet ways hearts are changed, broken families are healed, and second chances find their way home. In our own lives, hope is never truly lost. Not when we open our doors to forgiveness, kindness, and love, even when the world feels cold. Remember, every act of loyalty, every small kindness, every brave choice you make might be the very miracle someone is praying for. And sometimes, it is in loving and protecting the vulnerable, whether they have 2 legs or 4, that we come closest to God's purpose for us all. If this story touched your heart, share it with a friend who needs hope. Leave a comment about the miracle you're praying for, and subscribe for more true stories of faith and redemption. May God bless every viewer with courage, compassion, and a family found or chosen that never gives up on them. If you believe in second chances, if you believe that God still works miracles through ordinary people and loyal animals, write amen in the comments and let your faith shine for all to see.